do it like this. There you go.
All right.
Sorry about that.
The book talks about Marcus, this guy who was shopping at a mall. In the parking lot afterwards, he was robbed at gunpoint, and he was like shocked and like terrified when it happened, so he didn't respond to him. And they hit him with his gun, and like in the next couple of weeks following, like he couldn't get it out of his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about it, stuff like that. So, and that's basically what PTSD is. It's just like affecting you after the event and reliving the event. Symptoms of PTSD can obviously exposure to the traumatic event and then re-experiencing it like I just discussed. And then avoidance of associative reminders. This can be like thoughts, avoiding thoughts about it, avoiding activities or people or places that trigger it. You can't remember parts of the event due to being terrified. You have less interest in activities and detachment. With Marcus, in the book, he was an accountant, so he already didn't get a lot of social interaction, and that was specifically what they focused, or a part of what they focused on in the book was he had a lot of issues with detachment just because he had even less social attachment or less social interaction than he already did. Then there's negative mood effects, and then another thing which is kind of strange to me is like thinking about the event and focusing on the event so much that like it can stop you from like long-term things happening such as marriage and stuff like that because you're so like focused on the event that it affects your life that drastically. The physical things that can come from it are sleeping problems, which Marcus also suffered from, anger outbursts, concentration issues, hypervigilance, which is like extreme focusing on the event, and then you can become easily startled. One thing that specifically interested me when I first started it was like what's the difference between like just being like affected by an event and like what makes it actually PTSD. It's basically how long it can like affect your life. If it's like within the first month after the event, it's called acute stress disorder, and then after that month is when it actually becomes PTSD, and then it'll last usually a little bit longer than that. The causes of it, you know, unlike other anxiety disorders such as phobias and general anxiety disorder, that it's like kind of broad, this is like specifically related to one event, and it's often linked to helplessness. Like Marcus, for example, in the parking lot, he was completely helpless. It's also in incidents such as like rape and assault, robbery, and things that people, and natural disasters is a big one that like there's no control whatsoever to. So it just like gives them a sense that they have no control whether that happens again or not. Like there's nothing they can do. Biological factors. When I thought of PTSD, I thought of like, you know, there's not any biological factors. You have to experience it, but there are certain like biological factors that can like make you more susceptible to developing PTSD after an event. With anxiety disorders, it talks about genetics, brain features, neurochemical features, behavioral inhibition, and evolutionary influences. And that's just kind of overall anxiety disorders. It doesn't really talk specifically about PTSD, but the septal hippocampal system does, and that basically helps a person to respond to threats and remember highly anxiety-provoking situations. And if that's affected, then if you experience an event like that, like you're going to continue that part of your brain's going to continue to be activated even when no threat exists. The neurochemical features, such as neurotransmitters, specifically with PTSD, it's the norepinephrine. I don't know how to pronounce it. This is the neurotransmitter that's specifically affecting the PTSD. Yeah, that word. Prevalence and incidence, anxiety disorders as a whole, that's including phobias and all that stuff, affects 28.8% of Americans. PTSD has a lifetime prevalence of 6.8, which is kind of low, but then again, it's kind of high considering it's like how few wars and events like this actually go on. So, anxiety disorders as a whole are more common in females, so naturally they're more common in PTSD too, but this is an ongoing argument just because people say that females are just more apt and open to talking about having PTSD and stuff like that. So they say that that's the only reason it shows that they're more prevalent in females, that males are just hiding it and stuff. But there have been a bunch of case studies, so it's just a bunch of arguments. Basically, there's no definite results from that. It's more anxiety disorders are more prevalent in countries such as U.S., Colombia, New Zealand, and France. One of the articles that I used talked about It's used a very like drastic example. It said like someone that's living in like a hut in the dense jungle is obviously going to be more terrified of a tiger than someone living in an apartment in New York City. So it just, and that like that's not how they use it to find the differences or whatever, but it just shows an example of like depending on where you're at, where you live at, stress and anxiety disorders are going to be more prevalent. In my opinion, like our culture and the way America's set up, at least, and that's I think that's why like how high demand it is. That's why we develop so many more anxiety disorders than other people. There's some other theories on. Oh wait, all right, treatments. There's biological, psychological, and a bunch of theories that go into the treatment of PTSD. Biological treatments are basically medicines and antidepressants that people can take to affect their brain and just things of that nature. The psychological treatments can be educating on someone. You know, if someone knows like the symptoms, what causes it, when it comes up in their life, they can be able to manage that stuff better if they know when it comes up, be able to control themselves better, just being able to realize it. Then help someone to manage their emotions. This specifically talked about like in a counseling session, just like help them to be able to manage their other emotions and as well as things that tie into the event that happened. And there were some oddball things such as muscle relaxing and breathing treatment. In the breathing treatment, it actually suggested like taking them back to the scene of the crime and like helping them like because most people they're terrified when they go back to the scene of the crime. Just helping them like control their breathing will help like comfort their mind basically in that situation. And then helping them to go over the full event of the thing and realize that there's nothing more harmful that can come from that because they're not going through that anymore. This specific method, you know, it all depends on like how willing the person is to go back over the event and talk about it and discuss it. Theories that came from it, or theories about treatment. One study I read talked about it was a study on whether combat exposure and injuries made a difference in family functioning. And the quote that came from that was basically like the concluding thoughts of it was, the combat experience causes problems in post-war family functioning of combats independently of PTSD diagnosis being confirmed. It is therefore necessary to help all of the combatants and their families reintegrate regardless of their PTSD diagnosis. So this article is leaning toward just specifically like war people and people that go through combat, whether they have PTSD or not, should be treated. Another study article suggested rehabilitation counselors, just because they're so flexible and like people come in to these rehab counselors, that they can assess them, and if they can help them right there, they can, but if not, they have the right to like sign them and refer them to other people to get the help that they need. As far as how reliable the treatment is with the pills and the antidepressants and stuff like that, it works a lot from the results that I read. It works a lot as for short-term people, like within, I think it was 2 to 3 months after the event took place, but as you get farther and farther away from it, you're still being affected, it just kind of like wears off for the long-time sufferers of it. And then with pills, there's a lot of side effects and chain reactions that can happen, like with take this pill, well, it gives you heart problems, so you take this pill and just kind of builds up. With the psychological treatment, it usually works if the client is willing and capable to face the trauma, just like going over the event like I talked about earlier. If they're willing to talk about it and go through and figure out different solutions to it, then they usually come out better. And if they seek help like closest to after the event and don't wait a long time. And then just like any other article, a lot more research is needed to be done to develop the medicines and clinical work and different things like that to be able to make it a more treatable disease. That's all I have. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, 3 questions, 3 comments.
Did they decide like which treatment was the best overall for everyone?
There isn't really one for everyone. It kind of depends. Like for long-term people, a lot of it was the psychological stuff and just continuing to go to therapy. But it never really cured it. It just kind of helped them manage it. So, yeah.
Is your grandpa taking treatment?
No, my grandpa didn't take any kind of treatment whatsoever.
It's one of the issues with older generation that they don't go to mental health.
Like to what extent does it disrupt their functioning?
With certain people coming back, One of the articles I read talked about like specifically injuries, and that was the article that I read the conclusions of. Just talked about a lot of it's just like frustrations with our family and family functioning, as far as like being angry all the time, being irritable. You know, they're like if someone was in a really bad car wreck, like they're not going to want to drive. Like I watched Dr. Phil one time, and there's this lady who had her husband died and turning left-handed onto a street. So like everywhere she went, like she would map it out and go like 2 extra hours to get to where she was going, just because she wouldn't make a left-hand turn at all. So it's just like when it specifically like affects someone's life, like really, and just completely disrupts their day-to-day functioning.
Is there a high suicide rate?
With war veterans more so, and loss of loved ones. But I didn't really, other than that, I didn't like get a specific article that related to suicide, so I don't really know.
All right, good job.